The morning Della Ellsworth arrived in Caldwell, Kansas. The sky was the color of a bruise healing into gold, and the man leaning against the post office wall looked as though he had not slept in 3 days and did not care one bit about the fact. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell was still raw at its edges. A cattle town pressed up against the southern border of Kansas like a boot against a door it was not entirely sure it wanted to open. The Kishom Trail ran its veins right through the heart of the place, and with it came the dust, the cattle, the drovers, and all the particular noise that attached itself to men who had spent too long beneath an open sky. The streets were wide enough to turn a full wagon, and they smelled of horse and leather, and the kind of ambition that had not yet decided whether it would bloom or burn. Della stepped down from the stage with one carpetbag, one hatbox, and the expression of a woman who had made a decision, and intended to stand behind it regardless of what greeted her on the other end. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath a traveling hat and gray eyes that had seen enough of Ohio to know she did not want to spend the rest of her life there. She had answered an advertisement in the Caldwell commercial newspaper, placed by the owner of a dry goods store who needed a clerk with a good head for numbers and an honest hand. She had both of those things and several others besides. The man against the post office wall did not move when the stage rolled in. He had a lean, angular quality to him, the kind of face that a sculptor might have started with good intentions before deciding that character mattered more than symmetry. He was 31, tall without being imposing, with dark brown hair that wanted cutting and eyes the particular shade of green-brown that certain autumn hills possessed. He wore a working coat, well-made but lived in, and a hat that had seen weather. He was watching something down the street with the focused non-attention of a man whose mind was elsewhere entirely. Della did not notice him particularly, because she was looking for Mr. Harlan Briggs, the merchant who had sent her the employment offer. She had his letter in her reticule and she consulted it now, reading the address of the Briggs Dry Goods Emporium as though the street itself might offer her a test she needed to pass. A woman near the water trough, broad-shouldered and cheerful, called out to her, "You looking for somebody, honey? You've got the look of someone reading a map upside down." "Briggs Emporium," Della said. "I have an appointment. Straight down and left at the alley, you cannot miss it. Big blue awning, though the blue has faded some." The woman smiled. "You the new clerk Harlan's been waiting on?" "I hope so," Della said. "I'm Ruth Canfield. I run the boarding house on Maple. Most of the decent women in Caldwell end up at my table sooner or later." Della introduced herself, tucked the letter away, and started down the street. She passed the post office without looking again at the man leaning against it, and he did not call after her or make any gesture of greeting. He simply watched her go with the same distracted attention he had given everything else that morning, except that after she turned the corner his gaze stayed fixed on the empty space she had occupied for just a moment longer than was casual. His name was Matthew Maddox, and he was waiting on a letter that he suspected was never going to come. The letter he was waiting on was from his younger brother, James, who had gone south into Texas 8 months ago with a cattle outfit and had not written in 6 weeks. Matthew had sent 3 letters himself and received no answer, and the silence had taken on a particular weight. He was not a man given to catastrophizing, but he was a man who had already buried his mother and father both, and silence from family had a specific texture for him that was difficult to ignore. He waited another quarter hour at the post office, collected nothing, and walked back to the livery stable where he kept a gray horse named Crockett and where he did occasional work for the owner, a man named Porter Hale, whenever the trail driving season dried up and Matthew needed to fill the weeks between cattle contracts. He was not precisely a cowboy in the drifting sense, not anymore. He had drifted for 6 years after the war that had taken his father's spirit if not his body, and then he had settled in Caldwell the way a stone settles at the bend of a river, not by intention, but by the logic of current. He had a small room above the livery and enough money saved to make the next several months comfortable. And he had his work and his horse, and the quiet of a man who had made a kind of peace with solitude, though peace and contentment were not the same thing, and he was not always successful at confusing the two. Della Ellsworth, meanwhile, had found Harlan Briggs and was sitting across from him in the back office of the Emporium, demonstrating that she could do sums in her head faster than he could do them on paper, which delighted him considerably. Harlan Briggs was 52, a widower with a round red face and a handlebar mustache that he tended with more care than his ledgers. He was a fair employer, which was fortunate, and a man who measured people quickly and revised rarely, which could cut either way. He measured Della in about 4 minutes, liked what he found, and offered her the position at $4.50 a week with 2 days off and board at Ruth Canfield's if she needed it. She took it. She started the following morning. The first week in Caldwell taught her several things. She learned the layout of the store within a day, the inventory within 3, and the names of the regular customers before the week was out. She learned that the town was divided in the complicated way that cattle towns were always divided, between the permanent residents who wanted schools and churches, and the drovers who wanted saloons and open space, and that the line between those two factions shifted daily depending on who had money and who had the marshal's ear. She learned that the marshal's name was Tom Reese, that he was competent and tired, and that he walked with a limp from an old horse injury that he never discussed. She also learned on the 4th day that the man who came into the Emporium for a box of rifle cartridges and a spool of waxed thread was named Matthew Maddox, and that he worked sometimes at Hale's livery, and sometimes on cattle drives, and sometimes in the undetermined elsewhere that men in Caldwell occupied when they were between defined purposes. She learned his name because he gave it to Harlan when Harlan came out from the back and clapped him on the shoulder, and she learned the rest because Harlan had the informative habit of introducing everyone who came through his door with a small biography attached. Della, this here is Matthew Maddox. One of the steadiest hands in the county when he can be persuaded to apply himself. Matthew, this is Miss Della Ellsworth, come to us all the way from Chillicothe, Ohio, and already running my stockroom better than I have in a decade. Matthew looked at her with those autumn-colored eyes and took off his hat, which she noted because not everyone remembered to do that indoors. Miss Ellsworth, he said. Mr. Maddox, she said. He paid for his cartridges and his thread and left without ceremony, but at the door he paused and looked back at the shelf display she had rearranged that morning, the one with the canned goods organized by label and size rather than the random stacking that had characterized it before. That's better, he said, not to anyone in particular, and walked out. Harlan watched him go with an amused expression. High praise from Matthew. He is not what you would call effusive. I noticed, Della said, and went back to her inventory. She thought about him only in the passing way that one thinks about any person encountered briefly, the way a detail catches the eye without demanding examination. She had not come to Caldwell looking for anything except the independence that came with honest work and honest pay, and she had spent enough of her youth watching women attach their entire futures to men who turned out to be smaller than their promises to be in any rush toward that particular arrangement. Her mother had died when Della was 17, her father when she was 21, and the years between those losses and her departure from Ohio had been occupied with necessity, managing the family house, taking in sewing, keeping herself fed and purposeful. She was not bitter about it. She was simply clear-eyed in the way that people become when life removes the luxury of illusion early enough. May became June in Caldwell, and June became the full roar of cattle season, when the town swelled with drovers up from Texas, and the streets smelled permanently of trail dust, and the saloons ran at capacity from sundown until whatever hour the money ran out. The Emporium did good business because drovers needed supplies and the permanent residents needed everything a town in full traffic required, and Della worked long days that she did not mind because the work was interesting and she was good at it. She saw Matthew Maddox perhaps twice a week, sometimes more. He came in for supplies in the systematic way of a man who kept a mental inventory of what he needed, not browsing but moving directly to the items on his internal list, and then stopping at the counter with clean efficiency. He was not unfriendly, but he was contained, and he asked no questions about her and offered no observations beyond the practical. She respected this. She also found, after the first month, that she had begun to notice when he had not come in for several days, not with anxiety but with a kind of ambient awareness, the way one notices the absence of a familiar sound. It was Ruth Canfield who told her that Matthew had received a letter from Texas in the first week of June. Not from his brother directly, but about his brother. James Maddox had been thrown from a horse during a river crossing in April, and had broken his arm in 2 places and spent 3 weeks in a fever that had nearly taken him. He was alive but had been slow to recover, and the outfit he had been riding with had sent a note from San Antonio only when James was finally well enough that they felt the news could be delivered without causing more worry than it resolved. Ruth told Della this not as gossip, but as information, the way women in boarding houses traded useful knowledge about the people they were responsible for in the small daily ways of a community. He took it hard, Ruth said over supper one evening. Even the good news of it that James was alive, because of the weeks he had not known. Matthew is not one for showing what he feels, but I have known him 3 years and I can read him well enough. Della listened and said nothing particular in response, but she found herself thinking about it that night in her room at Ruth's boarding house, lying on her narrow bed with the window open to the warm Kansas night. She thought about what it meant to carry silence from the people you loved, to wait for a letter that did not come, to have the whole days shaped around an absence. She understood that feeling from the other direction, from being the one who had no one left to write to, and she found an unexpected point of recognition in it. She wrote letters herself. She had always written letters, long ones, detailed and observant, the kind that carried the texture of a place and a day in them. She had written to her cousin Margaret in Cincinnati and to her old schoolmistress and to the minister who had known her father. She wrote because it was the way she organized what she felt about things, the way she sorted observation from sentiment, and gave both of them a place to live outside her own head. The 4th of July in Caldwell in 1878 was a considerable event, because Caldwell had decided it was a real town and real towns celebrated the nation's birthday with sufficient ceremony to prove it. There was a parade of sorts, and a shooting competition, and a dance in the evening at the new community hall that had been built in the winter, and still smelled pleasantly of fresh lumber. Della went to the dance because Ruth Canfield insisted, and because she had worked 11 days straight and deserved the evening. She wore her best dress, a deep blue-green that she had altered herself to fit better, and she put her hair up in the careful way she saved for occasions. The hall was warm and bright and loud, and the fiddler was a Mexican drover named Esparza who played with a joy that made you want to move whether you intended to or not. Della danced twice with Harlan Briggs, who danced carefully and with a running commentary on the footwork, and once with the young man from the telegraph office whose name she kept forgetting and he kept reminding her of. She was standing at the edge of the floor with a glass of lemonade when Matthew Maddox appeared beside her, not with the approach of a man who had been watching for his moment, but with the slightly abrupt arrival of someone who had been moving in a different direction and had course-corrected. "Miss Ellsworth," he said. He was holding his hat in one hand, which she had noticed was a habit of his indoors. The coat he wore was cleaner than his usual working coat, a dark brushed wool, and it fit him properly. "Mr. Maddox, I did not think you would come to something like this." He considered that. "I am not always predictable." "No," she agreed. "I suppose not." They stood in silence for a moment that might have been awkward but was not quite, because there was something comfortable in his particular kind of quiet, the way it did not demand filling. The fiddler began a slower tune, and couples moved together on the floor. "I don't dance," he said, which she took as a declaration rather than an apology. "Neither do I particularly," she said, "but the lemonade is good." He got himself a glass and came back, and they stood together in that comfortable non-conversation for a while, watching the room. She could feel him thinking about something, turning it over, and she had learned enough about his rhythms by now to understand that he would say it if it mattered and leave it if it did not. "Harlan tells me you are good at the store," he said eventually. "Harlan is generous. He's not actually. He says exactly what he means. It's one of the things I respect about him." She looked at him sideways. "Then I will accept the compliment as accurate." A small something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. "I also wanted to say, I heard my brother is going to be all right, the one in Texas." She turned to face him more fully now. "I heard that too. I am glad, Mr. Maddox." "Matthew," he said, then, as if testing whether the word fit, "Matthew is fine." "Then I am glad, Matthew," she said. "I imagine you were worried a great deal." The something on his face shifted into something more complicated and more real. "I was," he said. "I am not good at waiting without knowing." "Few people are," she said. "Though I think men are sometimes taught to pretend otherwise." He looked at her then with a new quality of attention, the way a person looks at something they had not expected to find interesting and are now reassessing. "That's a fair observation," he said. "My name is Della," she said, "if we are dispensing with formalities." "Della," he said, and it sounded careful in his mouth, like something he was learning the weight of. The evening went on around them. They talked in the incremental way of two cautious people who have discovered a mutual wavelength, not at great length, but with more substance than their previous conversations had contained. She told him about Chillicothe and the work she had done before coming west, and about the advertisement that had brought her here. He told her about the cattle drives he had worked, the Kishom Trail and the land it crossed, the way the plains looked at night with nothing between you and the horizon except grass and stars. He walked her back to Ruth's boarding house at the end of the evening, not by arrangement, but by the natural logic of two people going the same direction. At the gate he stopped and she stopped, and the night sat large and warm around them with the sound of the music still faint from the hall behind them. "Good night, Della," he said. "Good night, Matthew," she said. She went inside feeling something she had not felt in a long time, a small tentative warmth that was not quite hope, but was made of the same materials. He went back to the livery and lay awake for an hour, and at some point he put his hand in the pocket of the dark coat he had worn to the dance and found nothing there, which was of course correct. There was nothing in that pocket, but for a brief disoriented moment he had been reaching for something that did not yet exist. The summer deepened, and with it so did the thing that was forming between Della Ellsworth and Matthew Maddox, not dramatically but with the organic accumulation of genuine attention. He came into the Emporium more often than his supply needs strictly required, which both of them understood without acknowledging. She began to predict which days he would come, and was right often enough that it would have alarmed her if it had not also pleased her. Their conversations grew longer and then longer still, until Harlan started making pointed departures to the back room whenever Matthew came in, with an air of elaborate disinterest that fooled no one. Matthew Maddox was, she discovered, a man of real intelligence and real feeling who had learned to carry both of those things in ways that did not show on the surface. He had read more than most people she had known, carrying books in his saddlebags the way others carried tobacco. He had strong opinions about certain things, about the treatment of the cattle he drove, about the land and what was being done to it, about the Comanche and Kiowa peoples who had been pushed from the plains of Kansas and Texas, with a systematic violence that he spoke of, with a controlled anger that told her the injustice of it had genuinely settled in him, and not just on him. She found this quality in him significant, because it was easy enough to dismiss what was done to the peoples of the land when you were benefiting from that displacement, and harder to sit with the knowledge and remain honest about it. She told him this one afternoon in late July, when the subject had come up in the context of a story she had read in the Caldwell newspaper about negotiations further south. "It doesn't make anything right," he said, "knowing it's wrong and still living in the middle of it." "No," she said, "but it's a start. Pretending it's not wrong is worse." He looked at her steadily. "You are very direct," he said. "I grew up alone enough that I stopped seeing the use in otherwise," she said. "I grew up with people and still stopped seeing the use in otherwise," he said. "Different road to the same place." She wrote to her cousin Margaret that evening and described him, which was something she had not done since the mention of any man in her letters to Margaret had produced such a cascade of excited correspondence that she had learned to be selective. She described him carefully and honestly, the way he looked and moved and spoke, the particular quality of his silences, the surprising warmth that lived under the contained exterior, and the autumn-colored eyes, and the hat he always took off indoors. She wrote 3 pages and folded them carefully and sent the letter the next morning. He, for his part, had begun to write letters to James with different content than before. He had always been a dutiful letter writer to his brother, giving practical information and asking practical questions. But in August he found himself including observations about Caldwell that were mostly observations about one person in particular, framed as observations about the town. James, who knew his brother well, wrote back asking pointed questions that Matthew answered evasively, and that James then asked again with more specificity. August brought a drought that turned the Kansas plains the color of old bone, and the cattle drives thinned out, and the town contracted into its off-season self. Caldwell in summer's end had a different rhythm than Caldwell in the full heat of cattle season, quieter and more internal, and Della felt the town shift around her like a living thing settling into rest. She had been in Caldwell 4 months. She felt with some surprise that she had been there much longer. In the second week of September, a man named Gareth Drum rode into Caldwell with a crew of 4, and the specific loud confidence of a man who had been told yes too many times. Drum was a cattle broker out of Wichita, and his business in Caldwell was legitimate, but his manner in the town was not. He occupied the saloon nearest the Emporium with his crew, and they were the kind of loud that did not consider other people, and he made a habit of coming into the Emporium in the mid-morning and talking to Della in a manner that started at familiar and moved progressively towards something less comfortable. She handled it the way she handled most things, directly and without excess emotion, telling him plainly on the 3rd visit that she was there to assist him with purchases and not with conversation, and that if he needed neither, she had other work to attend to. He found this amusing in the way that men like him find resistance amusing, as a thing to overcome rather than a position to respect. On the Thursday of that week, he was in the store when Matthew came in for 2 pounds of salt and a tin of pine tar for tending Crockett's hooves, and there was a moment in the tight space of the main aisle when Drum made a comment about Della that was just far enough into vulgarity to have crossed a line, and the temperature in the room changed. Matthew did not raise his voice. He set down the salt on the counter with a deliberate quiet and looked at Drum with an expression that was entirely still, and he said, "I would not say that again," in the particular tone of a man who means precisely what he says and nothing more and nothing less. Drum looked at him for a long moment, doing the arithmetic of the situation, and apparently decided that Matthew Maddox's arithmetic came out to more than he wanted to spend. He put some money on the counter for the item he had taken and left without the comment he had clearly been building toward. The door swung shut. Della looked at Matthew and Matthew looked at her, and she could feel the restraint in him, the careful, controlled quality of what he had just done. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I can manage him." "I know that too," he said. He picked up the salt. "That doesn't mean someone shouldn't say something." She looked at him for a moment and something settled in her chest, warm and solid like a stone left in the sun. "Thank you, Matthew," she said. He nodded once and paid for his salt and pine tar and left, and Harlan Briggs emerged from the back room with an expression of supreme pretended innocence and went back to his ledgers without comment, which was, Della thought, a considerable act of self-restraint. Drum and his crew left Caldwell 2 days later. The town exhaled. That Sunday, Matthew came by the boarding house at Ruth's, which was a different kind of occurrence than coming to the Emporium. Ruth answered the door and received him with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for something to happen and was glad it was happening, and called up the stairs for Della in a voice that carried considerably more pleasure than the situation strictly required. Della came down and found him standing in the front hall with his hat in his hands and a look of faint uncertainty that she had not seen on him before. He was wearing his good coat, the dark brushed wool from the dance, and he had clearly cut his hair recently, which she noticed with a small private pleasure. "I wondered," he said, "if you would like to walk." "Yes," she said, and went to get her shawl. They walked out along the western edge of town, where the prairie began in earnest, where the grass had gone gold in the September drought, and the sky was immense, and the silence had a texture to it that was different from the silence indoors, wider and less lonely. He walked beside her with his hands in his coat pockets and the hat back on his head, and she walked with her shawl around her shoulders and her face turned slightly toward the light, and for a long time neither of them said anything particular, and it was the best conversation she could remember having in a long while. "I have been meaning to ask you something," he said finally. She waited. "I am going to ride out to Wichita next week. There is a man there who owes me for some work I did in the spring and I need to collect. It is 2 days there and 2 back." He paused. "I was wondering if there was something I might bring you from there, if there is something you need." It was the most oblique thing she had ever heard, and she found it entirely charming. "You are asking if you can bring me something from Wichita," she said. "Yes. Is there something specific you had in mind?" "There are better book merchants in Wichita than here," he said. "I thought you might like a book." She looked at him with the full, candid warmth she usually kept more guarded. "I would like that very much, Matthew. I am fond of novels and of history." "Both," he said, as if making a note. "Both," she confirmed. They turned back toward town with the sun lowering behind them, and his hand brushed hers once as they walked, and neither of them said anything about it, but neither moved away from the other either. And by the time they reached Ruth's gate the distance between them had changed from careful to something more like comfortable. The way a room changes when you have been in it long enough to stop noticing the walls. He went to Wichita and came back 4 days later with 2 books wrapped in brown paper and a third one that he put in his coat pocket, and then thought better of and put in the paper with the others. He brought them to the Emporium on the morning he returned, and when she unwrapped them and found the 2 he had chosen for her, and the third one that she could tell from its cover was one he had bought for himself, she looked up at him with a question in her expression. "I thought you might want to read it too," he said. "When you are done with the others, and then we could discuss it." "You want to discuss books," she said. "I discuss things I find interesting," he said simply. She clutched the books to her chest for a moment, which was a gesture she would later be mildly embarrassed about. But he was looking out the window at that particular moment, and the embarrassment was hers alone. They discussed the first book in late October, sitting on the front steps of Ruth's boarding house on a cool evening, with a blanket that Ruth had pressed on Della before retreating inside with conspicuous delicacy. The discussion ranged from the book to the questions the book raised, and from there to the questions they each carried about their own lives, and it was the first conversation in which they both moved beyond the pleasantly guarded territory they had been occupying. He told her about his parents, his father who had farmed in Missouri, and never been the same after the war swept through and left the land altered, and the men who tended it altered alongside it. His mother who had died of a fever when Matthew was 19 and James was 14, and the particular silence that had settled in the house after, and the restlessness that had taken Matthew out onto the trails and kept him there for years. She told him about Ohio and the long quiet of her parents' deaths and the work that had kept her together during those years, and the decision to come west that had felt less like courage and more like the only remaining direction available that did not look like contracting further into a life she had not chosen. "You chose this," he said. "I chose to keep moving," she said. "The rest chose itself." "That is how I got here too," he said. He looked at the street, at the lantern light moving in the windows across the way. "Though I am less restless than I was." "Caldwell settled you," she said. He looked at her with a directness she was not quite prepared for. "Something in Caldwell," he said. The blanket was warm and the evening was cold, and she felt the specific heat of that admission settle into her like a coal dropped in dry grass, and she did not put it out. November arrived with the force of a conviction, hard and cold and honest, and Caldwell pulled in tight against the weather the way small towns do, their social warmth inversely proportional to the temperature outside. Ruth's boarding house became the center of Della's world in the evenings, the warmth of the common room and the company of the other boarders, and the frequent arrival of Matthew Maddox, who had taken to coming for supper on Thursdays with a regularity that everyone at the table acknowledged with identical pretended casualness. Ruth made a point of seating him across from Della. Della made a point of not commenting on this. Matthew made a point of arriving exactly on time, which told Della he had been thinking about it. Their conversations by now had the quality of a river that had found its channel, deep and directional. She knew his habits and he knew hers. She knew he woke early and thought slowly through problems and trusted instinct over analysis, but used both. She knew he kept his promises with a thoroughness that was not rigid but organic. He knew she was fiercely competent and occasionally lonely in the way that fiercely competent people sometimes are, because their competence creates a kind of insulation against the specific warmth of being needed. He knew she wrote long letters, and that the act of writing was not merely communication for her but thought itself. The way some people think by talking and others think by walking, she thought by forming sentences and giving them to the page. He had not yet told her that he had begun to think of certain things during the day that he wanted to tell her later, not because they were important or dramatic, but because he had been saving them for the specific audience of her attention, which was a form of longing he had not previously categorized. She had not yet told him that she had stopped writing to Margaret about other topics, and that her letters now were primarily about him, which was something she knew and acknowledged to herself and found both embarrassing and appropriate. On the last Saturday of November, there was a hard freeze and a light snow, the first of the season, and the world outside Ruth's windows was the kind of still that snowfall creates, a held breath. Della was off from the Emporium and had spent the morning reading by the fire, and in the afternoon she went out into the crystalline afternoon to walk because she could not sit still when the air had that particular clean quality. She was coming back along the street, past the livery, when she saw Matthew outside with Crockett, the gray horse looking irritable about the cold, and Matthew checking one of the front shoes with the methodical patience he brought to all animal-related work. She stopped and watched for a moment. He was speaking to the horse quietly, which she could not hear from where she stood. The horse snorted and flicked one ear. He looked up and saw her, and something happened in his face that she recognized now as a specific rearrangement of happiness, the way he looked when something he had been hoping for had arrived. "Della," he said. The name in his mouth had long since stopped being careful and had become simply itself, natural and sure. "Your horse is objecting to winter," she said. "He objects to everything but winter particularly." He set the hoof down and straightened. "Have you been walking far?" "Just around the edges." She came closer and offered her hand to the horse, who investigated her mitten with enormous suspicion. "Hello, Crockett." The horse apparently decided she was acceptable and let her scratch behind his ear. Matthew watched this with an expression she could not entirely read, something quiet and full at the same time. "I have been thinking," he said, which was usually the beginning of something. "I know," she said. "You get a particular look." He blinked. "Do I? You do." A kind of focused squinting at the middle distance, like you are reading something the rest of us cannot see. He considered that. The horse nudged her shoulder with its great gray head. "I have been thinking," he said again, "that I would like to court you properly, if that is something you would want." He said it directly and without preamble, in the manner of a man who has been rehearsing something that is better delivered plainly. "I am not a man who has much that is fancy, but I am steady, and I believe I would spend a great deal of effort making you happy if you gave me the occasion." The snow was very still around them. The horse exhaled a great white cloud. Della looked at him and felt the warmth she had been carefully managing since July expand beyond its careful boundaries, and she thought about all the ways she could respond to this, and settled on honesty. "Matthew Maddox," she said, "I have been waiting for you to say something of that general nature for 3 months, and I was beginning to think I might have to say it myself." The not-quite smile became an actual one, and it changed his whole face, opening it in a way that she had not seen fully before, and that she knew with complete certainty she wanted to go on seeing. "Then I am glad I said it," he said. "So am I," she said. Crockett was given an apple from Matthew's coat pocket, which he accepted as his due, and they walked back through the snow toward Ruth's with their shoulders close enough to touch. Courtship in Caldwell, Kansas, in the winter of 1878 looked like this. It looked like Thursday suppers and Sunday afternoons, and walks in the cold afternoon light, and books passed between them with notes penciled in the margins. It looked like Della saving observations during the day that she wanted to share with him, and Matthew doing the same, and the two of them reconstructing their days for each other in the evenings, with the pleasure of an audience who was genuinely interested. It looked like Ruth Canfield watching with satisfaction from the kitchen doorway, and saying nothing whatever about it. It looked like Harlan Briggs finding reasons to close the Emporium 10 minutes early when Matthew came to walk Della home. It looked like the first time he held her hand, not the brushing contact of the October walk, but a deliberate warm clasp. One evening in December when they were walking back from the community hall where there had been a Christmas program, and she turned her hand over in his and held back, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. He kissed her for the first time 2 days before Christmas, on the front steps of Ruth's in the cold December evening, carefully and with a seriousness that matched everything else about him, and she kissed him back with rather more enthusiasm than she had anticipated she would feel, which surprised them both pleasantly. He walked home that night with his hands in his coat pockets and the specific feeling of a man who has stepped into a current and found it warm. She went upstairs and wrote 4 pages to Margaret without stopping, and then laughed at herself quietly in her dark room. Christmas that year was the most fully inhabited holiday Della had experienced in 7 years, since before her mother had died and left the season with a gap in it that nothing else had quite filled. Ruth made a feast, and there were 8 people around the table, including Matthew and including James, who had traveled up from Texas and arrived on the 23rd, thin but healing, and with a grin like his brother's, only louder. James Maddox was 26, rangy and brown from the Texas sun, and he looked at his brother and then at Della and then at his brother again, with an expression of someone processing information faster than he could organize. "So this is Della," he said, at the first available moment, with the tone of a man who had been reading between the lines of letters for several months. "This is Della," Matthew confirmed, with a quality of quiet pride that she found she was not embarrassed to be the subject of. "Matthew has not mentioned you," James said. "James," Matthew said. "He has not mentioned you specifically," James continued with great enjoyment. "But I will tell you that in the past 3 months his letters have somehow been entirely about the Emporium, the weather, and the state of the western Kansas livestock trade, while also being somehow entirely about someone who works at the Emporium." "James," Matthew said again, more firmly. "I'm just clarifying," James said, turning an angelic face toward his brother. He extended a hand to Della. "It is genuinely nice to meet you, Miss Ellsworth. My brother has good taste." Della shook his hand and said, "I hope your arm has healed properly," and James looked briefly surprised and then gratified that she knew about it. which told Della that Matthew had discussed his worry about his brother's health with her in a way that James recognized as significant coming from his typically contained sibling. Christmas dinner was loud and warm, and the kind of evening that becomes a fixed point in memory, something you return to later as the measure of what good things are made of. Matthew was different with James than he was alone or with other people. Looser, quicker to laugh. The older brother quality in him visible in the way he absorbed his brother's needling with patient affection. After supper, when the table had been cleared and the others had drifted to different corners of the room, Matthew found Della by the window that looked out at the dark December street and stood beside her. "He likes you," he said quietly. "I like him," she said. "He is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone quieter, given the source material." He made the low sound that was his version of a laugh. She had come to treasure that sound disproportionately. "He is the opposite of quiet," he said. "He is very happy," she said, "and very glad you are happy." He was quiet for a moment, and she felt him looking at the side of her face in the particular way he had when he was deciding whether to say something. "I am happy," he said very simply. She looked up at him. "I know," she said. "I am too." James went back to Texas in the new year, taking the stage south with a saddlebag and a handshake for his brother that held in it the compressed warmth of men who do not say certain things directly because they both already know what those things are. He hugged Della, which surprised her, and told her to keep writing letters to his brother. "He saves them," James said quietly, and there was something in the saying of it that she did not quite understand at the time and filed away. January of 1879 was cold and particular, the kind of Kansas winter that makes the summer miraculous by contrast. The Emporium was quiet, and Della had time to reorganize the back storeroom, which she had been wanting to do since October, and to read 2 of the 3 books Matthew had brought from Wichita, and to begin writing a long letter to James by way of thank you for Christmas that turned into a lengthy correspondence about Texas and the landscape there and the cattle business, which she found she had more opinions about than she had expected. Matthew and Della fell into the winter rhythm of a deep and sustaining companionship, the kind that builds on itself daily, that surprises you by its solidity when you stop and look at it clearly. They had arguments sometimes, small ones, mostly about ideas, and these arguments had the quality of healthy friction between 2 people who respected each other enough to disagree. She found his caution occasionally frustrating. He found her impatience occasionally alarming. They told each other these things, which was possible because they had both developed enough trust in the other's fundamental good faith to survive honest conversation. He had begun writing her letters. This happened in January, when she was occupied one evening with something that kept her from their usual Thursday supper, and he came home from the livery to find the evening longer than expected and found himself, without entirely planning it, writing her a letter instead of sitting with the absence. It was not a long letter. It covered the events of his day at the livery, and a thought he had had about the book they were reading, and a question about a conversation they had not finished the week before. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket, intending to give it to her the next morning. He did not give it to her. He gave it to her in a different form, by having the conversation it had contained the next morning when he came into the Emporium, but the letter itself stayed in his pocket, and the night after that he wrote another one, again with the intention of giving it to her, and again the letter stayed in his pocket when the morning came. He was not sure why he did this. The act of writing to her was connected to something in him that had no clean name, the same thing that made him feel her absence on the evenings they did not see each other as a distinct and physical subtraction from the day. The letters were the thinking done in her direction. He did not send them because when he saw her, the letters became unnecessary, the conversation supplanting them, but after each conversation there was always something remaining, and so there was always another letter. By February there were 7 of them in his coat pocket. By March there were 12. They accumulated with the gradual weight of everything he was finding in her. Her intelligence and her humor and her particular quality of attention. The way she held onto things he said as though they had value, which was itself a value he was not accustomed to. He was aware that this was not normal behavior, keeping letters you had written to someone in your own coat pocket like some kind of private ledger. He thought about it sometimes with a certain self-directed amusement and went on doing it anyway. The spring of 1879 arrived in Caldwell with the returning cattle drives and the returning noise and the returning sense of a town with its blood up, and alongside it arrived a problem. The problem's name was Chester Vance, and he was the owner of a competing dry goods operation that had opened in Wichita, and was now sending a man named Elias Pryor to Caldwell to undercut Harlan Briggs on wholesale prices and poach his suppliers. This was legal, if unkind, and Briggs had weathered competition before, but Pryor was not above certain other tactics that were less legal and less kind, including spreading rumors about the quality of Briggs's goods and the reliability of his accounts. Della saw the threat clearly and moved on it with the systematic efficiency that was one of her defining qualities. She revised the pricing structure on the items most at risk, drafted a letter to 3 of the suppliers in Kansas City that addressed the rumor about reliability with documented evidence to the contrary, and put together a proposal for Briggs that involved expanding the store's offering into 2 categories where Pryor had no comparable product. Briggs read her proposal on a Tuesday morning and sat quietly for a moment and then said, "I am going to give you a raise." "Thank you, Harlan," she said. "And I am going to be very upset if someone takes you away from me," he said. She laughed. "I am not going anywhere." "That is not entirely in your control," he said, and gave her the look of a man who has been observing things from behind his ledgers and has certain opinions about the direction they are traveling. She told Matthew about the situation with Pryor that evening, over supper at Ruth's, and watched his expression cycle through listening and thinking and a kind of settled determination. "Pryor came through the livery 2 weeks ago," he said. "Left 2 horses for shoeing. He talked a great deal while he was there." "What did he say?" "Nothing specific. He was the kind of man who talks to hear his own authority." Matthew considered. "He mentioned he was representing a Wichita outfit." "I did not connect it to Harlan's store." "It is connected now," she said. "Then I will ask around." He had the network of a man who had been in the town long enough to know everyone and who moved easily through all of its social strata, from the cattle buyers to the drovers to the townspeople proper. Within a week, he had learned enough about Pryor's methods and the Wichita outfit's larger strategy to give Della and Harlan a picture they could use. Pryor left Caldwell in April, his mission having succeeded to a degree, but not the degree he had aimed for, because Briggs had managed to strengthen 3 of the supply relationships before Pryor could fully undermine them. Harlan gave Della the raise he had promised and told Matthew in the direct way he had that he was grateful for his help. "She did the work," Matthew said. "I just found some information." "That is also work," Harlan said. "It wasn't hard work," Matthew said. "Some things you do because they matter to you." Harlan looked at him with a smile that a sculptor might have described as knowing. "Yes," he said, "I have observed that about you." April was warm and green after the long winter, and the prairie came back to itself in the dramatic way it always did, as if the gray and brown months had never happened and the land had simply been saving itself for this. Della walked out into it on her afternoons off and felt the particular expansion of a person who has been indoors too long, the sky drawing her upward. Matthew rode out with her sometimes on those afternoons, on Crockett, while she walked, and they moved through the greening grass with the companionable ease of 2 people who no longer needed the infrastructure of occasion to simply be in each other's company. On one such afternoon in the 2nd week of April, he told her that he had been offered a contract for a cattle drive that would take him north to Dodge City and back, 6 weeks, starting in mid-May. She listened to this with a calm face that did not entirely represent what was happening under it. "It is good money," he said, and I have done less driving this past winter than usual." "I know," she said. "You should go." "I will write," he said. He said it straightforwardly and then stopped as if he had said more than he meant. She looked at him sideways. "I will write back," she said. There was a small silence. "James told me," she said, "that you save letters." He was looking at Crockett's neck. "James talks too much," he said. "He said it as a good thing," she said gently. He was quiet for a moment. "I do," he said simply. "I save letters from people who matter to me." "Do you have many such letters?" she asked. "Some from James," he said. "Some from my mother years ago." He paused. "Lately of a different kind." She waited. He did not say anything more on the subject, and she did not press because she had learned the particular rhythm of him, and she understood that there were things he would say in his own time and that pressing never improved the timing. But she thought about it, walking back through the afternoon grass with the wind at her face. She thought about what letters he saved and why, and she felt something in her chest that was tender and complicated and entirely certain of itself. She wrote him a letter before he left. A real one, addressed and folded, given to him at the gate of Ruth's boarding house on the morning he departed, with Crockett packed and ready at the livery and the early May light still tentative and new. He took the letter and looked at it and put it in his coat pocket. "Come back safe," she said. "I will," he said, with the quality of a man making a promise rather than stating an intention. He came back in 6 weeks, as contracted in the last week of June, 2 days ahead of schedule because the drive had gone well, and he had pushed the pace on the return leg. He came straight from the livery to the Emporium and walked in the door at 10 in the morning, while Della was in the middle of helping a customer select calico prints, and the customer, an observant older woman named Mrs. Hartley, took one look at the expression on both of their faces and said, "I will come back this afternoon," and left with a smile that contained an entire editorial. "You're early," Della said. "I pushed the pace," he said. She looked at him across the width of the store, dusty and trail-worn, thinner than when he had left from 6 weeks of hard riding, with the particular alertness of someone who has been outdoors and watchful for too long and is now allowed to stand still. "I missed you," she said, because she had decided in his absence that there were certain things she was going to stop managing so carefully. Something happened in his face. "I missed you very much," he said, and the very much was a measure of how much he meant it. He had written her 4 letters from the trail, sent back from Dodge City and from the stops along the route, and she had written him 3 in return, sent forward to the agreed-upon stops. Each letter from her that he received he had put in his coat pocket, and when she had given him the letter the morning he left that had gone in alongside the others. And now the pocket of his working coat contained 7 of her letters, and all 12 of the letters he had written to her over the winter and had never sent. The letters he had written to her were no secret to himself. They were the measure of everything he had been feeling since January, all the things that had seemed too large to say directly in the context of the evening, and had found their form on paper instead. They were not letters he had decided to keep. They were letters he had kept by not giving, and the distinction mattered to him in some private way he had not fully articulated. She did not know about them. He came for supper that evening, cleaned up and with the trail gone from him, and Ruth made the particular roast that had become his customary welcome-back meal over the years, and the whole evening had a warmth that was almost tangible, the warmth of a household with someone returned to it. After supper they sat on the front steps in the summer dark, the first night of fireflies in the grass across the road, and she told him about the weeks he had been gone, and he told her about the drive, the landscape of the plains in the full push north, the night sky over Dodge City, a foal born during a crossing of the Cimarron River that had made the whole crew stop and watch. At some point during the telling she leaned her shoulder into his, and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that in the warm Kansas night, while the fireflies did their small bright work in the grass, and everything was as settled and right as anything Della Ellsworth had experienced in her adult life. "Matthew," she said. "Yes. I do not need you to make any grand declarations," she said. I know what I feel and I believe I know what you feel and I am content in that, but I want you to know that I am not simply passing through. Caldwell, I mean, or this. She gestured slightly with one hand. This situation. He turned to look at her. This situation, he repeated with a warmth underneath the mild amusement. You understand my meaning, she said. I do, he said. He was quiet for a moment. I have been trying to find the right time to say something. You could say it now, she said. He thought about this carefully in the way he thought about important things. I would like you to stay, he said. Not just in Caldwell with me, properly I mean. I want to marry you, Della, if that is something you would say yes to. She heard the question in its full weight and felt it land in her with the completeness of something she had already decided in advance of being asked. Matthew Maddox, she said, turning to face him fully. Yes. His expression opened in that way she loved, all the contained quality of him giving way to something entirely unguarded, and he held her face in his hands and kissed her in the summer dark with the fireflies going on with their business in the grass. And Ruth Canfield, who had been watching from behind the gauze curtain of the parlor window, went to the kitchen and began calculating how large a wedding dinner she could produce on reasonable notice. They were married in the second week of September 1879, in the small white church that Caldwell had managed to build with some difficulty in 1877 and was very proud of. James came up from Texas again, this time with more notice and in better health, and arrived 2 days before the wedding in a state of extended cheerfulness that even Matthew could not reasonably object to. Ruth Canfield organized everything with the efficiency of a general and the warmth of a grandmother. Harlan Briggs stood up for Matthew, which surprised some people and surprised neither Matthew nor Harlan nor Della, because the friendship between those two men was one of the solid things in the town's informal architecture. Della wore a dress that she and Ruth had made together over the August evenings, ivory muslin with a trim of blue ribbon that matched the September sky. She carried wildflowers that she had gathered herself from the prairie that morning, which was not conventional but was entirely herself. Matthew stood at the front of the church with the look of a man who is standing in exactly the right place and knows it, and when she came down the aisle toward him, the expression on his face was so plainly and completely what she had hoped for that she had to keep her chin up and her breath steady to avoid doing something undignified. The ceremony was simple. They had written their own words to say, quietly, and the minister read from Scripture and they exchanged the simple gold band that Matthew had sent to Kansas City for, and James Maddox produced a handkerchief that he used with more frequency than the occasion strictly demanded, and that Matthew observed with the brotherly forbearance of a man who was too happy to tease anyone about anything today. Ruth's wedding dinner was the finest thing that had been served in that boarding house, a fact acknowledged by everyone present. There were 8 couples and James and 3 other town worthies, and the food went on for 2 hours, and the conversation went on for 3 more, and at some point in the evening Matthew leaned over to Della and said very quietly, "I have something to give you," and she looked at him with curiosity. He put his hand in his coat pocket. Not the dress coat he had worn for the ceremony, but the dark working coat that he had changed into after, the one he wore daily, the one that had been with him through the winter and the spring and the cattle drive and back again. He brought out a small stack of papers, folded and refolded, worn soft at the edges from many months of pocket living. They were not uniform in size, some clearly torn from whatever was at hand, some cut from proper letter paper. They were held together by a piece of twine, and they had the love-to-pieces look of things that have been handled repeatedly. She looked at them and then at him. "These are letters I wrote you," he said, "between January and May. I wrote them in the evenings and then I kept them. I'm not sure I can explain all of why." She took them carefully, untied the twine. The topmost letter was dated the 14th of January, and the paper had thinned at the fold lines from repeated opening and closing, and the ink was still clear, though the edges had gone soft with time and handling. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the particular quality of a man who has done something vulnerable and is waiting to understand what it will cost him. "You kept them," she said. "I kept them," he said. "All of them. All of them," he said. "I was going to give them to you when the time was right, and then there was never a right time, and then I thought it was too strange, and then I thought maybe this was the right time." She looked down at the small, worn stack in her hands and understood, without needing to read them yet, what they contained. She understood that these papers were the interior of the man she had just married, set down in ink over the months of their courtship, all the things he had thought and felt and had not quite said in the evenings they had spent together. "You wrote to me every time you could not say it," she said. He looked at her with steady, surprised eyes. "Yes," he said. "I suppose that is exactly it." She held the letters against her chest for a moment, the way she had held the books he bought her in Wichita, and this time she was not embarrassed by the gesture, and he was watching, and he found it the most entirely right thing he had ever seen. "I am going to read them," she said. "Every word. Later." "I know," he said. She reached over and took his hand and held it, and the whole room went on around them. James laughing at something across the table, Ruth carrying out another platter, Harlan saying something to the minister about the early frost expected this year. And the two of them sat inside the warmth of it, all with their hands joined, and the worn soft letters between her fingers. That night in the small house that Matthew had rented on the good side of the main street in anticipation of having someone to share it with, she read the letters, all of them. She read them in order, from the 14th of January to the 3rd of May, sitting by the lamp while Matthew slept in the next room, and she felt with each letter the sedimentary accumulation of his feeling for her, built up over months in the private space of evenings alone, all the tenderness and the humor and the careful observation that were already familiar to her in the man, but were somehow different on the page, more concentrated, more exposed. He had written about watching her in the Emporium and the particular way she dealt with difficult customers, with a calm that he had found beautiful to observe. He had written about the Sunday afternoon walks and what she had said about the land and about the Comanche and about her parents' deaths. He had written about the Christmas evening when James had come and the way he had felt standing in that warm room with both of them in it. He had written, in the February letter, something that made her have to stop reading and look at the ceiling for a moment, because the plainness of it was almost too much to take in directly. "I believe I have been in love with you since October, and possibly before, but October is when I stopped being able to pretend it was something else. I am not sure what to do with that except to write it down where you cannot see it and see how it feels on paper." It felt, she thought, like a man who had loved her faithfully and quietly, and with great seriousness for months before either of them had said anything of consequence about it. She folded the last letter carefully, and the fold lines went soft and willing because the paper had been folded and unfolded enough times to know how it was done, and she put them all back together and tied them with the twine and held them in her lap for a long, quiet moment. Then she went into the bedroom and lay down beside her husband, and he stirred and opened his eyes in the lantern light. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. "Then, Matthew, yes, February 14th. He was quiet for a moment, and then the not-quite smile moved across his face in the near dark. "A specific one," he said. "Yes," she said, "a specific one." "I meant it," he said. "I know," she said. "I meant to write you the same thing in March and then couldn't quite, and then couldn't again in April, and then you left for the drive and I gave you the letter at the gate and I had tried to put it in there without saying it quite directly." "You almost did," he said. "Did I?" "In the third paragraph," he said. "I read it 4 times to be sure." She laughed quietly in the dark. He put his arm around her and she settled against him with the letters still in her hand. And the house was warm, and the September night was just beginning its cool descent toward autumn. And outside on the Kansas prairie the grass was going gold in the darkness, the same gold it had been when she had arrived, though it looked different to her now, looked like home. The first winter of their marriage established the rhythms of their shared life, and those rhythms had the quality of something that has been waiting to exist. She continued at the Emporium, which Harlan had not questioned for a moment, and which Matthew had not questioned either, because he understood the importance of the work to her and respected it as he respected everything about her that was essentially herself. He did fewer cattle drives that winter. Not out of obligation, but because the particular restlessness that had sent him out onto the trails in the first place had significantly diminished in the presence of a home that actually felt like one, and Porter Hale at the livery always had enough work to keep a capable man occupied. They built things together in the evenings, not with lumber but with the small daily constructions of a shared life, routines and preferences, and the knowledge of each other's moods. The way she liked the morning to be quiet before she was fully awake, the way he liked to sit with a book for an hour after supper, the particular ease that came from being with someone you did not have to perform for. She saved his letters. The ones he had given her on their wedding night went into a cedar box she kept on the wardrobe. Alongside the new ones he continued to write her when he had thoughts that were better given to paper than to air. He still did this, wrote her letters that contained the overflow of his thinking and feeling, and now he actually gave them to her, slipping them under the breakfast plate or leaving them on the table by her reading chair, and she read each one and wrote back when the mood moved her, and their correspondence continued alongside their spoken life like a second river running parallel. Spring of 1880 brought something new. Della had suspected it since February and confirmed it in March, and told Matthew on a Thursday evening in the third week of March, on the front steps of their own house now rather than Ruth's, with the early crocuses pushing up through the cold ground along the porch. He went still the way he went still when something was too large for immediate response, and then he turned and looked at her with an expression that had no category she had seen before, something entirely new on the familiar terrain of his face. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed, watching him with a slight uncertainty because the newness of his expression was difficult to read. "Della," he said, and then he did not say anything else for a moment, but he took her hands and held them, and the expression on his face resolved itself into something she could name, a joy so unguarded it was almost startling on him. "A baby," he said again, as if the word needed repeating to become real. "In September," she said, "more or less." He put his arms around her carefully as if she had become suddenly precious in a new dimension which she found both touching and mildly amusing. "I will not break," she said into his shoulder. "I am exactly as sturdy as I was yesterday." "I know," he said. He stopped. "You just what?" "I am very happy," he said simply and without qualification. She held him back with equal warmth and looked out over the shoulder of his coat at the crocuses in the cold March ground, and thought about how a place becomes a place, how a life becomes a life, by the accumulation of exactly these kinds of moments. She told Harlan the following week, and he sat down behind his desk and looked at the ceiling and then at her and said, "I suppose that was coming," with the tone of a man receiving news that is simultaneously good and personally complicated. "I will need to find someone." "Not immediately," she said. "I intend to work until August." "You intend to work until the day before," he said, knowing her perfectly. "August 15th, she said. "I have already planned the transition." He shook his head with a great fondness. "Of course you have." She had indeed planned it. She spent the spring training Nora Gibbs, a capable young woman of 20 who had been in Caldwell since childhood, in the workings of the Emporium. Nora was quick and willing, and took to the work with a readiness that told Della she had been looking for something like this for a while. Della felt a specific satisfaction in this, in the passing on of skills and systems to someone who would carry them forward. Matthew wrote James about the baby in April, and James wrote back by return mail, with an extended and enthusiastic response that Matthew read at the breakfast table and then read aloud to Della, who laughed at the passages James had written with obvious deep feeling and only token attempts at restraint. "He is going to be an appalling uncle," Matthew said. "He is going to be a wonderful uncle," Della said. Appalling and wonderful are not incompatible. Summer progressed with a slowness that Della occasionally found trying, because the heat and the growing weight of her body did not combine well with the temperature of a Kansas July, and she was grateful for the Emporium's comparative coolness and for Matthew's steady attentiveness, which was practical and warm in equal measure. He was good at the practical aspects of care without being smothering, and she appreciated this. He kept the house cool, fetched water, managed the evening cooking with an uncomplaining competence that she had not fully known to expect from him, and once or twice a week he brought her wildflowers from the prairie, not with ceremony but set down on the table as a matter of course, the way a person puts down something they have been carrying that belongs to someone else. She worked until August 12th, 3 days earlier than she had planned, because on August 11th she came home from the Emporium in the late afternoon with a tiredness that was a different quality from the usual, and Matthew took one look at her and said, "Tomorrow, rest," in the tone that told her he had made an assessment and was not going to be argued with, and she decided that the 3 days were not worth the argument and let Nora take the remaining week. Ruth Canfield had been involved in every Caldwell birth of the past 12 years, and she took charge of the situation with an authority that was entirely welcome. Matthew stayed close during the labor and during the long, difficult hours that followed, and what Della remembered later about those hours was not primarily the difficulty, though it was considerable, but the specific presence of him, the hand held through the worst of it, the voice steady and low at her ear, and the total unwavering quality of his attention that she had first noticed in a cattle town emporium in a different spring, and had relied on ever since. On the morning of the 15th of September 1880, their son arrived in the world. Matthew Maddox held his son for the first time in the warm morning light of their bedroom, and looked at him with the expression of a man confronting something entirely beyond the reach of any previous experience. And the letter he wrote to James that afternoon was the longest letter he had ever written, and contained more honest feeling than any letter before it. And James wrote back by return post that he was coming to Kansas as soon as the current outfit would release him, and that God help any baby who had Matthew Maddox for a father, because the child would grow up unusually quiet and well-read. They named him Thomas James Maddox. Thomas for Matthew's father, James for the uncle who had already claimed a proprietary affection for him in absentia. Thomas James Maddox was not quiet. He arrived in the world with opinions about it, expressed at volume, and he continued to have opinions at volume for the first several months of his life, and Matthew and Della navigated the beautiful, exhausting landscape of new parenthood with the same quality they brought to everything, steadily and together. James arrived in October as promised, thinner than ever from the Texas work but brown and grinning, and he held his nephew with a tenderness that made Matthew look away and blink more than the situation strictly required. Caldwell continued to grow and change around them. 1880 brought a push for incorporation and more organized governance, the predictable friction between the cattle trade interests and the farming interests, and the temperance interests that was the permanent background music of any Kansas cattle town. Della followed this with the engaged attention she brought to all civic matters and had opinions that she expressed in the appropriate forums, which some people found surprising and others found entirely natural. Matthew did not find it surprising. He found it one of the consistent pleasures of being married to her. Harlan Briggs expanded the Emporium in the spring of 1881, adding a hardware section that had been Della's idea, proposed in a letter she wrote him from home during the winter months, and backed with enough market analysis to constitute a business argument rather than a suggestion. He executed it, and it was immediately successful, and he acknowledged her contribution publicly and with characteristic directness. Thomas grew through his first year with the characteristic thoroughness of a healthy and opinionated child, moving from opinions expressed in noise to opinions expressed in increasingly purposeful mobility and eventually in words, which arrived early and in force. He had Della's gray eyes and Matthew's angular jaw, and the particular combination of determination and warmth that each of them recognized in the other. He slept, in his first winter, in a crib beside the bed, and sometimes in the deep cold of a January night Della would wake to the sound of him stirring and find that Matthew was already awake, already reaching. This was the kind of thing she folded into her letters to Margaret, the small moments that were the actual substance of a life. Margaret had married in 1879 and had her own small boy now, and their correspondence had become the long exchange of two women who understood each other and were glad to have someone who did. Della found, in the spring of 1881, a piece of a letter in the pocket of Matthew's working coat. The coat had been in need of mending where the lining had separated at one seam, a task she had been putting off, and when she turned the pocket out to check the extent of the damage, she found a folded piece of paper that had become two pieces because the fold line had worn through completely. The paper was thin as old cloth, and the ink was still legible. She looked at it and recognized it immediately. It was from one of the letters from the wedding night bundle, the ones he had given her, the ones that now lived in the cedar box on the wardrobe. She recognized the handwriting and the paper, and then she looked again at the coat and understood. He had not given her these letters from his coat pocket. He had taken them from his coat pocket to give to her, which meant these letters had lived in the pocket of this coat for months, possibly longer, being handled and read and folded and unfolded until the paper had given way. She sat down at the kitchen table with the two pieces of the letter in her hands. Thomas was asleep in the next room. The morning light came through the window in the particular way of April, full of yellow and dust motes. She thought about Matthew in the evenings of last winter, in the months before they were married, writing her letters and then putting them in his pocket. She thought about what it meant to keep something that close, to carry it on your person through the daily work of a life, to take it out and read it back in the small private moments of an evening alone. The letter she was holding was the February 14th one. She knew it not only from the date at the top, but from the texture of the paper, this one more worn than the others because he had taken it out more. I believe I have been in love with you since October, and possibly before, but October is when I stopped being able to pretend it was something else. She read it again in her kitchen on an April morning with her son asleep and her husband at the livery, and the full Kansas spring coming in through the window, and she felt the particular compound emotion of a woman who knows she is loved, and who holds the physical evidence of the precise moment that love had been set down and kept and carried. She put the two pieces together carefully on the table and looked at them for a long time. When Matthew came home for midday dinner, she had them set on the table beside his plate. He came in and hung up his hat and saw them. He stood very still. She was at the stove and she looked at him over her shoulder, and he looked at her, and she could see him reading her expression and understanding that she was not upset, that what was on her face was not reproach but something else entirely. He came to the table and picked up the two pieces and held them together and looked at them with the expression of a man who has been found out in something private but finds, examining the discovery, that it is all right to have been found. "The lining of your coat needs mending," she said. "I found that in the pocket." "I know the coat needs mending," he said. "I have been putting it off." "Because of the pocket?" she asked. He set the pieces down and looked at her with that steady, unguarded quality he had shown her on their wedding night. "There were others," he said, "all in that same pocket. I'd take them out sometimes in the evenings." "To read," she said. "Yes." She came away from the stove and stood across the table from him. Thomas made a small sound from the next room and went quiet again. "Matthew," she said. "Yes." She reached across the table and put her hands over his. "You carried them in your pocket all winter," she said. "Yes." "And through the spring." "Yes." "And you read them." "Yes." He held her hands. "I wrote them to you, and I could not give them to you, and then they were what I had." She looked at him with the full, warm weight of everything she felt for him, everything that was made of 3 years of particular and sustained attention to a specific man, and the understanding she had built of who he was. "I would like you to know," she said, "that if you had given them to me when you wrote them, I would have felt exactly as I feel now. And if you had never given them to me at all, I would have felt exactly as I feel now." He looked at her with something in his face that was the same thing he had felt standing at the front of that small white church in September 1879, the certainty of the right place. "Which is," he said. "Loved," she said. "I feel loved, Matthew, with a great deal of consistency and specificity, which is the best kind." He came around the table to her side, and she stepped into him, and he held her in their kitchen in the April morning light with Thomas sleeping in the next room and the Kansas spring going on at the window. And they stood like that for a long, quiet moment that required nothing from either of them except to be in it. Later she mended the coat with the careful stitches she had learned from her mother, and she mended the letter with a thin strip of paper pasted at the back along the seam, and it went into the cedar box with the others, and the cedar box sat on the wardrobe in their bedroom where it had always been, and neither of them spoke about it again in a way that required words. The spring of 1881 moved into the summer, and the summer moved into the fall with the satisfying inevitability of seasons that are going the right direction. Harlan Briggs hired Nora Gibbs permanently and expanded the emporium further, and the business was prosperous enough that he talked about retirement, though anyone who knew him understood that retirement meant working slightly fewer hours on things he enjoyed rather than any meaningful reduction in activity. Matthew was offered a partnership in the livery by Porter Hale, who was getting on in years and wanted someone younger to carry the operational weight. He came home with the offer and sat at the kitchen table and looked at Della across it. "What do you think?" he said. "Tell me the terms," she said. He told her the terms. She asked 4 questions that led to 2 more conversations with Porter Hale and a negotiation that Matthew was confident about, and that resulted in a partnership agreement that Della reviewed with the meticulous eye she brought to all financial documents and pronounced sound. "You should take it," she said. "It would mean I am less movable," he said, "more tied to Caldwell." She looked at him steadily. "Matthew, we have a son, and a house. And I am rather permanently attached to Harlan Briggs's operation at this point. We are already tied to Caldwell." "I know," he said. "I wanted to make sure you were comfortable with that." "I came here on purpose," she said. "I did not arrive in Caldwell accidentally and find myself trapped. I chose this." He looked at her with the autumn-colored eyes that had not changed in the 3 years she had known him except to become more familiar, which was its own kind of beauty. "I know," he said. "I wanted to hear you say it." "I chose Caldwell," she said, "and I choose you, Matthew, every day without reservation. Is that clear enough?" The not-quite smile became the real one again. "Reasonably clear," he said. He took the partnership. The following year brought changes of various kinds. Caldwell continued its slow transformation from raw cattle town to something more settled, more self-conscious about its permanence. Schools were built and expanded. The cattle trade remained the economic engine, but the farming operations that were spreading across the surrounding territory were visible on every horizon. Matthew watched the land change with the informed attention of a man who had ridden it for years and knew its moods, and he spoke of it sometimes with Della in the evenings, with the nuanced appreciation of someone who understood both what the land had been and what it was becoming. Their daughter was born in June of 1882. Thomas was almost 2 by then, old enough to be curious and young enough to be uncertain about the new arrangement, and he examined his sister with the expression of a small scientist confronting an unexpected result. They named her Clara Ruth, the Ruth for Ruth Canfield, who cried upon hearing it and then denied crying, and produced a new blanket of extraordinary warmth and softness that she had apparently been knitting since February. James came up from Texas again, because he had developed the habit by now, and because Clara Ruth's arrival was an occasion that could not be missed. He arrived to find Matthew standing in the kitchen with his daughter asleep on his chest, swaying gently in the manner of a large, quiet man who has discovered the specific quality of a sleeping infant and is reluctant to disturb it. James stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at his brother for a long moment and then said, very quietly, "Mother would have liked this very much." Matthew looked at him. "Yes," he said, "she would have." Della, resting in the next room and listening to the low voices in the kitchen, felt something settle in her that was the particular resolution of a grief she had not known she was carrying for him, the grief of having not had her parents to share these days. She thought of her mother, who had died young and who had loved her, and she thought that if the dead can know anything, her mother knew. She hoped they all knew. Clara Ruth was a peaceful baby where Thomas had been a loud one, and she grew with the sunny curiosity of a child who finds the world interesting on the world's own terms. Thomas, after the initial uncertainty, took to her with the proprietorial affection of an older sibling, bringing her things he considered valuable, showing her objects of interest, explaining the world to her in the earnest manner of a 2-year-old who has considerable opinions about everything. Matthew watched his children with an attention that was identical in quality to the attention he gave everything he cared about, steady and full and unhurried. He told them stories in the evenings, the kind of stories that grew from the actual landscape they lived in, stories about the plains and the rivers and the animals, stories that Della sometimes listened to from the other room because she loved the sound of his voice in the telling. She wrote all of it down, not just in letters to Margaret and James, but in the journals she had kept since her mother's death, the long, careful record of a life examined and preserved. She wrote about Caldwell and about the Emporium and about the changes in the territory as Kansas settled further into itself. And she wrote about her children and about her husband with the same unsentimental clarity she brought to all her observations, which meant that the love in the writing was evident not through declaration, but through the precision of her attention to its details. He found one of the journals once, left open on the kitchen table in 1883, and he read one page before he understood what it was and put it down. The one page he had read was a description of a September evening in which he had been trying to explain something about the cattle trade to Thomas, who was 3 and relentlessly curious, and the description of his face as he searched for the words a 3-year-old could understand was so specific and so warm that he had to stand there at the kitchen table for a moment collecting himself before he went on with what he had been doing. He left the journal exactly as he had found it and did not mention it, but that evening he wrote her a letter, a new one, and left it on the breakfast table the next morning. She read it with her first cup of coffee while the children were still asleep. It said, "I have been trying for some time to find the right way to tell you what these years have been. I am going to keep trying. In the meantime, please know that I understand, every day, what I have." She put the letter in the cedar box with the others, which was already quite full. By 1884, the cedar box had been replaced by a larger wooden box that Matthew had made himself over the course of a winter, a proper box with a fitted lid and a latch, large enough for everything they had written to each other through the years. She had her letters from him, and he had the letters she wrote him, and both collections had accumulated to a weight and volume that spoke to the sustained nature of what they had built between them. Thomas started school in the fall of 1884, which felt to both of them like a moment that required more preparation than it had received, though Thomas himself was entirely ready and arrived at the schoolhouse with the look of a child claiming territory that was rightfully his. Clara Ruth stood at the gate with Della and watched her brother go in with the school crowds and turned to look up at Della with a question that was not entirely about Thomas. "Will I go?" she said. "In 2 years," Della said. Clara Ruth appeared to calculate this against her internal timeline and find it acceptable. "Will you still be at the store?" "Yes," Della said. "Good," Clara Ruth said. "I want to come work with you when I am big." Della looked down at her daughter with a warmth that she did not attempt to contain. "I would like that very much," she said. Matthew was at the livery gate when they came back, having seen Thomas into the schoolyard, and he looked at the two of them coming along the morning street, and had the expression he sometimes had in such moments, the one that was made of more than he could say directly. He opened the gate for them, and Clara Ruth ran through with the specific energy of a child who has been behaving well for an extended period and has earned release. "He went in fine," Della told him. "I know he did," Matthew said. "That's Thomas." "He has your stubbornness," she said. "He has your stubbornness," he said. "Mine is quieter." She laughed and walked through the gate he was holding, and he fell into step beside her. And they went along the morning street of their town, in the fall of 1884, with their small daughter running ahead of them, and the livery behind them and the emporium ahead, and the life they had built from a carpetbag and a Cattletown advertisement spread in all directions around them like the Kansas prairie, familiar and wide in theirs. The years that followed moved with the pace of years that are being lived fully, which is to say both quickly and with substance, so that looking back they seemed at once brief and densely populated with things that mattered. Clara Ruth did come to work at the emporium when she was big enough to be useful, starting as a child who sorted small items and graduated over years to actual work that she did with a competence that made Harlan Briggs, who was working fewer days by then, and had passed the main operation to Della in a handshake agreement that he had never bothered to formalize because he trusted her completely. Say that Della Ellsworth's daughter was going to give him the comfort of knowing the emporium was in good hands for another generation. Thomas grew into a young man with his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, and an interest in the land that eventually led him to study agricultural science, a field that was developing rapidly in the 1890s as Kansas turned itself toward farming as much as ranching, and which suited his particular combination of practical intelligence and genuine feeling for the earth. Matthew and Della in their middle years had the particular quality of couples who have built something real together and know it, who look at each other across a room or a table with the comfort of long knowledge and find, underneath the comfort, the original warmth still burning, changed by time but not diminished by it. They still wrote letters. This was a fact that James found perpetually charming and slightly baffling, given that they shared a house and presumably could simply say the things to each other. But he had come to understand that the letters were not a substitute for saying things but an additional layer of the saying, and that Matthew and Della Ellsworth Maddox communicated on multiple frequencies simultaneously, and that this was one of the ways they sustained what they had. James himself married in 1886, a Texas woman named Vera who was brown-eyed and competent, and who liked Della immediately, and found in her a correspondent of considerable force and warmth over the years that followed. James and Vera came north most Christmases, and their children and the Maddox children grew up knowing each other with the specific closeness of cousins who see each other regularly enough to be genuine friends. Ruth Canfield died in the spring of 1891, at the age of 72, in her own boarding house in her own bed, which was as she had planned it. The boarding house was left to a niece from back east. The gap she left in Caldwell was real and measurable, the way a foundation stone is real and measurable when it is removed. Della and Matthew sat with her in her last days and held her hands, and Ruth said, in one of those clear late moments that people sometimes have, that she had been satisfied with her life and particularly satisfied with the part of it that had included watching those two find each other. "I watched you from the window, you know," she told Della, "the night of the July dance when he walked you home." "I know you did," Della said. "You weren't as subtle as you thought." Ruth laughed, a short real sound, and patted Della's hand. "You were very careful with each other," she said. "Good and careful, I like that." "He was worth being careful about," Della said. Ruth looked at her with the eyes of a woman who has known many people well, and has sorted them into the ones who matter and the ones who fade. "Yes," she said. He was. They buried her in the Caldwell cemetery on a warm May morning, and Matthew stood beside Della in the sun with his hand at the small of her back. And afterward they walked home through the town they had lived in for 13 years, and it felt different in the way that places feel different after losing someone who helped make them what they were. But it also felt like theirs, more fully than before, if that was possible. Because that is what happens to the places that hold your losses. They become more deeply part of you. The depth is bought with grief, but you do not wish the place away. You hold it closer. Caldwell in the 1890s was a different town from the cattle trade Caldwell of the late 1870s. The great trail driving era had wound down as the railroads extended and the cattle shipping moved east, and the town had transformed itself into something more permanent, more agricultural, more settled. It had schools and a hospital of sorts, and a newspaper and civic organizations of the kind that characterize towns that have decided they intend to persist. Della was a figure in that town, in ways she had not particularly planned, but that had accumulated naturally from her years of capable and honest work and her willingness to speak plainly in community meetings, and her long relationship with the emporium that had become, under her effective management, the central commercial establishment on the main street. When the question of a public library came up in 1892, she was on the founding committee. When a new school building was proposed in 1893, she was involved in the fundraising. When there were disputes about business practices or supply contracts, people came to her because she had been reliable for too long to be doubted. Matthew, for his part, had built Hale's livery into one of the better-run operations in the county, not flashy but sound, and he had developed a reputation for honesty in horse dealing and horse care that drew clients from considerable distance. He had taken on 2 apprentices over the years, one of whom had gone on to start his own livery in Wichita, and sent Matthew a letter of thanks that Matthew kept in the box alongside all the other letters. Their later years had the texture of a life that knows itself. They had history now, the long history of a place and a time, and the people they had been through it. They had the children who were becoming their own people, with their own choices and their own stories beginning to branch from the family trunk. They had each other with the specific completeness of 2 people who have been paying sustained attention to the same thing for many years and have not grown tired of it. On the evening of their 20th wedding anniversary, September 1899, Matthew and Della Maddox sat on the front porch of their house, which was the same house they had lived in since their marriage and which had been added to and improved several times over the years until it was comfortable and warm and deeply theirs. Thomas was in Topeka. Clara Ruth was at the Emporium closing up. She managed the afternoon shifts now with a capability that made Della proud in a way that ran deeper than pride, something more like recognition. James and Vera had sent a letter and a bottle of something from Texas. The evening was warm for September, the sky going orange and rose over the flat Kansas distance. Matthew had the wooden box in his lap. Della looked at it and then at him. "I thought," he said, "that we might look at some of these." 20 years of letters, she said. That is a considerable archive. He opened the box and she leaned toward him and they looked at what was in there, the careful accumulation of a life written back and forth between 2 people who had never stopped finding things to say to each other. He found the February 14th letter near the bottom, still in 2 pieces held together by the strip of paper she had mended it with. It was thin as gauze now, the ink faded but legible, and he held it with the care you would give something precious and fragile. She looked at it. "October," she said. He looked at her sideways and there was the not-quite smile, still there after 20 years, still doing what it always did to her chest. "October," he confirmed. "I believe it was late September for me," she said. He turned to look at her more fully. "September. There was an afternoon," she said, "when you came into the store and you were telling me about the drive you had just finished, and there was something about the way you talked about the Cimarron at night. I thought, this is the person I want to know for the rest of my life." "You never told me that," he said. "I am telling you now," she said. He put the letter carefully back in the box and closed the lid and set the box aside and looked at her on the porch in the September evening of their 20th year. This woman who had arrived in a cattle town with a carpetbag and gray eyes, and the particular kind of competence that was its own form of beauty, who had looked at him and found something worth knowing and then gone on finding it for 20 years without flagging, who had saved everything he had ever written her and whose writing he had saved in return, who had built a life alongside his that was stronger than either could have been separate, who had given him 2 children and a home and the specific daily comfort of being completely known by someone who found you knowing everything still worth the knowing. "Della," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am still," he said, searching for the word with the patience he had always brought to things that mattered. "I am still, with you, always still." She understood exactly what he meant. She had understood him for a very long time. She took his hand in the September evening, in the ordinary, extraordinary way she had been taking it for 20 years, and held it, and the Kansas sky went on with its business above them, the light pulling back toward the horizon in the ancient daily way, and the prairie spread out in every direction dark and wide and familiar. And in the house behind them was the life they had made together, in all its fullness and weight and gratitude, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of enough that a person can rest inside for the rest of their days. The letters stayed in the box on the bedroom wardrobe in the house in Caldwell, in the town they had chosen and that had chosen them back. Some of them were so old now that the fold lines had softened and the paper had the translucent quality of age, and the ink had gone from black to a warm brown, but the words were still there. They would be there for a very long time, every word still true.